Worship has become one of the most misunderstood concepts in the modern church. For many, it has been reduced to a scheduled event, a performance that happens for a few hours on Sunday morning. But is this what God intended? The original design of worship was never about a specific day or a specific place. It was about a lifestyle. Yet many believers have adopted a mindset where worship is something they attend rather than something they live. This shift has created a generation of Sunday morning Christians who are present in the sanctuary but absent in the spirit. In this message, we will expose the deception of Sunday morning worship and rediscover the true meaning of worship as a lifestyle. It is time to break free from the routine of religious gatherings and step into the reality of daily communion with God. Worship is not an event, it's a lifestyle. This simple yet profound truth has been lost in the modern church. Many believers have reduced worship to a 2-hour Sunday morning service where they sing a few songs, listen to a sermon, and go home believing they have fulfilled their spiritual duty for the week. But worship was never meant to be a scheduled activity. It was meant to be a way of life. Worship is not what we do for a moment. It is who we are at all times. From the beginning, God designed worship as an expression of our relationship with Him. When He created Adam, there was no designated day for worship, no set time to sing, and no structured format. Worship was simply the natural response of a man living in perfect fellowship with his Creator. Adam didn't wait until a certain day to acknowledge God's presence. He lived in His presence. That was worship. His every breath, His every action, His every word was in alignment with God's will. There was no separation between life and worship, because life itself was worship. But something changed. As humanity drifted from intimacy with God, worship became an external practice rather than an internal reality. Instead of living in a state of continuous worship, people began to set aside certain times and places for worship. This shift turned worship into a religious activity rather than a lifestyle. People started seeing worship as something they did rather than something they lived. And so we created churches, built altars, formed choirs, and designated worship leaders. While none of these things are wrong, they have contributed to a mindset that worship is something we attend rather than something we embody. The problem with treating worship as an event is that it limits God's presence to a time and place. Many people walk into a church building on Sunday morning, lift their hands, sing loudly, and feel the presence of God. But the moment they leave, they return to a life where worship is absent. They don't seek God on Monday. They don't acknowledge Him on Tuesday. They don't spend time in His presence on Wednesday. By Thursday, they are running on empty. By Friday, they are spiritually drained. And by Saturday, they are desperate for Sunday morning to refuel them. This cycle reveals a dangerous misunderstanding. Worship was never meant to be something we start and stop. Worship is supposed to be the fuel that sustains us every single day. Jesus made it clear that worship is not about a place or a moment. When He spoke to the Samaritan woman at the well, she asked Him about the right location for worship. Should people worship in Jerusalem or on the mountain? Jesus responded by shifting her focus away from a location and toward a lifestyle. He said, "The hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth." This was a radical statement. He was saying that worship is not confined to a particular place or time. Worship is not about rituals or routines. True worship is a matter of the heart. It is not something you turn on when you enter a church and turn off when you leave. It is a way of life, a constant awareness of God's presence in everything you do. Worship is not just singing songs on Sunday. Worship is how you speak to your family when no one is watching. Worship is how you handle conflict when people mistreat you. Worship is how you conduct yourself at work, how you treat your employees, how you respond to challenges. Worship is reflected in your obedience, in your integrity, in your love for others. Worship is every decision you make that aligns with God's will. If worship is only something you do when the music is playing, then you don't truly understand worship. If worship is only something you engage in when a pastor tells you to lift your hands, then you are missing the essence of what God desires. The reason many people struggle in their faith is because they have compartmentalized worship. They have a time for God and they have a time for everything else. They worship God on Sunday, but they live for themselves Monday through Saturday. This double life creates a spiritual imbalance. It is why so many believers feel disconnected from God during the week. They rely on Sunday morning to give them a spiritual boost because they have neglected worship throughout the rest of the week. Imagine if you only ate food once a week. No matter how much you eat on that one day, your body will still be weak and malnourished because you are not consistently feeding it. Worship is the same. If the only time you worship is on Sunday, your spirit will be weak. You will lack the strength to overcome temptation. You will struggle to hear God's voice. You will find yourself spiritually dry, needing another Sunday service just to keep going. But if you live a life of worship, if you walk in His presence daily, if you acknowledge Him in all things, if you surrender every moment to Him, you will be spiritually strong. You will not depend on Sunday to revive you because you are constantly connected to the source of life. Worship is about intimacy. It is about a relationship. God is not looking for people who visit Him once a week. He is looking for people who walk with Him daily. Imagine a marriage where a husband only speaks to his wife for 2 hours once a week and ignores her the rest of the time. That would not be a healthy relationship. Yet this is how many believers treat God. They give Him attention on Sunday and then ignore Him the rest of the week. That is not worship. That is not love. That is not relationship. God desires worshipers, not churchgoers. He is not impressed by how well we sing. He is moved by how well we live. A life of worship is a life of obedience. It is when you forgive when it's hard. It is when you give without expecting anything in return. It is when you love the unlovable, when you trust God even when it doesn't make sense, when you honor Him in your thoughts, words, and actions. Worship is not what happens on a stage. Worship is what happens in your heart. One of the greatest deceptions of the enemy is making people believe that worship is a Sunday morning event. The devil does not mind if you worship on Sunday as long as you don't worship on Monday. He does not mind if you lift your hands in church as long as you don't lift your life in surrender during the week. He does not mind if you sing the right songs as long as you live the wrong life. True worship is not measured by how loud you sing in a service, but by how closely you walk with God outside of it. If we truly understood worship, it would transform the way we live. We would wake up every morning with gratitude in our hearts. We would go through our day with an awareness of God's presence. We would speak, act, and think in a way that honors Him. Our work would become worship. God is calling us back to true worship, a worship that is not confined to a building, not limited to a time slot, not dependent on a feeling. He is calling us to live in His presence, to seek Him daily, to honor Him in all we do. Worship is not a Sunday morning event. Worship is a daily surrender. Worship is a lifestyle. Many believers have unknowingly fallen into the trap of religious routine, mistaking structured practices for true devotion. Over time, worship has become something that people do out of habit rather than out of a deep and personal connection with God. The danger of religious routine is that it creates a sense of obligation without transformation. It conditions people to go through the motions without ever experiencing the reality of God's presence. When worship becomes a routine rather than a relationship, it loses its power to change lives. One of the biggest problems with religious routine is that it creates a false sense of spiritual security. Many people believe that because they attend church regularly, sing worship songs, and listen to sermons, they are truly worshiping God. They equate activity with spirituality, assuming that as long as they are participating in religious practices, they are in right standing with God. But true worship is not about what you do in a church building. It is about the condition of your heart. It is possible to lift your hands in worship on Sunday and still live in disobedience the rest of the week. It is possible to sing every song with passion, but have a heart that is far from God. Jesus Himself warned about this when He said, "These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me." He was addressing people who had perfected religious routine, but had lost genuine intimacy with God. Religious routine also creates complacency. When worship becomes a routine, it no longer challenges or convicts. People begin to settle into a pattern where they do what is expected without truly engaging with God. They pray the same prayers, sing the same songs, and listen to the same messages, but their hearts remain unchanged. Over time, They become comfortable in their routine and lose the hunger for more of God. They no longer seek deeper encounters with His presence because they are satisfied with the motions of religion. This is why so many believers feel spiritually stagnant. They are stuck in a cycle of routine worship without real transformation. Another danger of religious routine is that it creates a transactional relationship with God. People begin to treat worship as a duty they must fulfill, rather than an expression of love and devotion. They approach worship with the mindset that if they do their part, attend church, sing songs, give offerings, then God will bless them in return. Worship becomes less about seeking God and more about receiving from Him. This mindset is dangerous because it reduces worship to a ritual rather than a relationship. True worship is not about what we can get from God. It is about surrendering our hearts to Him completely. It is about giving Him the honor and glory He deserves, not because we want something in return, but because He is worthy. Religious routine also creates a reliance on external factors rather than a personal connection with God. Many believers have become dependent on the church service, the worship team, or the preacher to create an atmosphere of worship for them. They only feel connected to God when the music is playing or when the pastor is delivering a powerful message. But the danger of this dependency is that it makes worship conditional. If the music is not right, if the sermon is not inspiring, or if the service does not meet their expectations, they struggle to engage in worship. This reveals that their worship is not rooted in a personal relationship with God, but in external experiences. True worshipers do not need a specific environment to connect with God. They worship Him in their daily lives, in their quiet moments, and in their personal time with Him. One of the most deceptive aspects of religious routine is that it can look very spiritual from the outside. People who are trapped in routine worship often appear dedicated and devout. They attend every service, participate in every event, and serve in various ministries. But despite their outward involvement, they can still be spiritually dry. This is because religious activity does not automatically equate to spiritual depth. A person can be active in church, but distant from God. They can do all the right things, but lack true intimacy with Him. This is why Jesus rebuked the Pharisees. They were experts in religious routine, but had no real relationship with God. They followed every rule, observed every tradition, and performed every ritual, yet their hearts were cold and disconnected from Him. Breaking free from religious routine requires a shift in mindset. It requires believers to move from a place of obligation to a place of true devotion. Worship must become more than just a scheduled activity. It must become a lifestyle. This means seeking God beyond the walls of the church. It means engaging in worship not just when the music is playing, but in everyday life. It means cultivating a personal relationship with God that is not dependent on a Sunday service. True worshipers understand that their connection with God is not limited to a time slot on the calendar, but is a daily pursuit. To break the cycle of routine worship, believers must examine their hearts. They must ask themselves, am I truly worshiping God, or am I just going through the motions? Do I seek God only when it is convenient, or is He the center of my life? Is my worship rooted in a deep love for Him, or is it just a habit? These are tough questions, but they are necessary. Worship is meant to be an intimate encounter with God, not a religious exercise. It is meant to transform us, not just be something we check off our spiritual to-do list. Another key to breaking free from routine worship is to cultivate a spirit of gratitude and awe. Worship should never become dull or mechanical. If worship feels like a chore, it is a sign that something is missing. True worship comes from a heart that is constantly in awe of who God is. When believers take time to reflect on His goodness, His faithfulness, and His love, worship becomes a natural response rather than a forced activity. Worship should be fueled by revelation, by a fresh understanding of God's character and His presence in our lives. Intimacy with God is the ultimate cure for religious routine. The more time believers spend in His presence, the more their worship will become authentic and passionate. Worship is not just about what happens in a church service. It is about a daily connection with God. It is about walking with Him, talking with Him, and living in a way that honors Him. When worship becomes a lifestyle, it transforms every aspect of life. It is no longer just about singing songs. It is about living a life that reflects God's glory. True worship requires surrender. It requires believers to let go of their preconceived ideas about what worship should look like and allow God to lead them into deeper encounters with Him. Worship is not about tradition, it is about transformation. It is not about routine, it is about relationship. The moment worship becomes a lifeless habit, it loses its power. But when worship is fueled by a genuine love for God, it becomes a source of strength, joy, and spiritual renewal. God is not looking for routine worshipers. He is looking for those who will worship Him in spirit and truth. He is looking for people whose hearts are fully devoted to Him, not just on Sundays, but every single day. Worship is not about fulfilling an obligation. It is about experiencing the presence of God in a real and personal way. The danger of religious routine is that it creates a form of godliness without true power. Adjacent to me, it gives the appearance of devotion without the reality of transformation. But when worship becomes a lifestyle, it changes everything. It draws believers closer to God, deepens their faith, and fills them with His presence. Worship is not an event, it is a way of life. It is not something to be scheduled, it is something to be lived. The call to worship is God desires worshipers who will seek Him daily, love Him fully, and honor Him with their lives. The danger of religious routine is that it replaces true worship with empty activity. But when believers break free from routine and step into a life of genuine worship, they experience the fullness of God like never before. Worship is not just for Sunday morning, it is for every moment of every day. God is seeking those who will worship Him in spirit and in truth. This statement from Jesus in John 4:23-24 is more than just a command. It is a revelation of what true worship is meant to be. Many people have been conditioned to believe that worship is about attending a service, following a routine, and engaging in outward expressions of reverence. While these things may have their place, they do not define worship in its purest form. Worship is not about tradition, rituals, or emotions. It is about connection. It is about encountering God in a way that is deeply personal, transformational, and aligned with His nature. Worship in spirit and truth is the kind of worship that pleases God, but many believers struggle to understand what it truly means. To worship in spirit means that worship is not confined to physical actions or locations. It is not about external performances, but about an internal posture of the heart. This is why Jesus told the Samaritan woman that the time had come when worship would no longer be limited to a mountain or a temple, but instead true worshipers would worship in spirit. This was a radical shift. In the Old Testament, worship was closely tied to a specific place, the temple, the altar, the tabernacle. But Jesus was revealing that true worship was never about a building or a location. It was about the condition of a person's heart. This means that a person can attend church, lift their hands, sing the right songs, and still not be worshiping in spirit. Worship in spirit means engaging with God beyond the physical. It means connecting with Him on a level that is beyond the senses. Worship in spirit requires authenticity. It cannot be mechanical. It cannot be done out of obligation or routine. It is not just an activity that takes place on Sundays. It is a way of life. A person who worships in spirit does not need a perfect environment to encounter God. They do not rely on a worship leader to take them into God's presence because they are already living in His presence. They worship at home, in the car, at work, in the midst of trials, in moments of joy, and even in times of uncertainty. Worship in spirit means that there is no separation between a person's spiritual life and their daily life. Every action, every word, every thought is influenced by a deep awareness of God's presence. Many people struggle with worship because they have been conditioned to believe that it is an experience rather than a lifestyle. They associate worship with emotions, how they feel in the moment, whether the music moves them, or if the atmosphere is right. But worship in spirit is not dictated by emotions. It is not dependent on a certain kind of music or a particular kind of service. It is rooted in a deep, unshakable connection with God. Worship in spirit means worshiping when you feel like it and when you don't. It means lifting your hands when life is good and when life is painful. It means that your worship is not based on circumstances but on the unchanging nature of God. True worshipers do not worship God because of what He does for them. They worship Him because of who He is. To worship in truth means worship must be based on who God truly is, not on our own ideas, traditions, or emotions. Many people worship God based on their personal preferences rather than on the truth of His Word. They create their own version of God, one who fits their lifestyle, their desires, and their comfort zones. But true worship is not about creating God in our image. It is about aligning ourselves with who He really is. Worship in truth requires knowing God as He has revealed Himself in Scripture. It requires seeking Him with a heart that desires to know Him, not just to receive from Him. Worship in truth also means worshiping with sincerity. Many people worship with their lips while their hearts are far from God. They say the right things, sing the right words, but their lives do not reflect true devotion. This is why Jesus rebuked the Pharisees. They were religious experts, but their worship was empty, because it was not rooted in truth. They followed traditions but had no real relationship with God. Worship in truth means that what we declare with our mouths must match how we live. It means that we do not just sing about surrender, we actually live surrendered lives. We do not just declare that God is our provider, we trust Him with everything. We do not just say He is our Lord, we submit to His will. Worship in truth is about integrity. It is about living in a way that is consistent with what we claim to believe. One of the greatest hindrances to true worship is a divided heart. Many people try to worship God while still holding on to other things. They want to give God their praise, but they also want to maintain control over their lives. They worship on Sunday, but live according to their own desires the rest of the week. This kind of worship is not worship in truth. True worship requires full surrender. It requires a heart that is undivided, fully devoted to God. When a person worships in truth, their entire life reflects that worship. Their decisions, relationships, and priorities align with God's will. Worship is not just something they do. It is who they are. The reason Jesus emphasized worship in spirit and truth is because these two elements must work together. Worship in spirit without truth leads to emotionalism, an experience-driven faith that lacks substance. Many people chase after feelings and spiritual highs, but have no foundation in the truth of God's Word. They move from one emotional moment to another, but never develop a deep, lasting relationship with God. On the other hand, worship in truth without spirit leads to legalism, an empty, mechanical religion that follows rules but lacks life. Some people have knowledge of the truth, but no intimacy with God. They know Scripture, they understand doctrine, but their worship is dry and lifeless. True worship requires both spirit and truth, a heart that is alive in God's presence, and a mind that is anchored in His Word. Worship in spirit and truth is what transforms lives. It is not about attending a service. It is about becoming a living sacrifice. It is about living every day in surrender to God. A true worshiper does not need a Sunday service to remind them to worship, because they are already living in a state of worship. They wake up with gratitude. They walk through life with an awareness of God's presence. They seek His will in everything they do. Their worship is not limited to a moment. It is woven into every part of their existence. God is not looking for performers. He is looking for worshipers. He is not impressed by how well we sing. He is moved by how well we live. A person who worships in spirit and truth does not separate their worship from their daily life. Their worship is reflected in how they treat others, how they handle adversity, how they respond to challenges. Their worship is visible not just in a church service, but in their character, their integrity, their love for people. Worship in spirit and truth is a call to authenticity. It is a call to go beyond surface-level religion and step into a deep, intimate relationship with God. It is a call to let go of tradition, routine, and man-made expectations, and enter into the kind of worship that pleases God. True worshipers are not defined by how often they attend church, but by how deeply they know and love God. They are not measured by their outward expressions, but by the reality of their inner devotion. Jesus made it clear, the Father is seeking those who will worship Him in spirit and in truth. This means that true worship is not optional, it is what God desires. Worship is not about us, it is about Him. It is not about what we feel. It is about who He is. The call to worship in spirit and truth is an invitation to experience God in a way that goes beyond religion. It is an invitation to live in His presence, to walk in His truth, to surrender completely to Him. This is the kind of worship that changes lives. This is the kind of worship that pleases God. This is true worship. Scripture, meditation. Many believers have unknowingly confined their worship to a specific time and place. Sunday morning services have become the primary, if not the only, moment in which they engage in what they believe is worship. They arrive at church, sing the songs, lift their hands, listen to a sermon, and then leave, believing that they have fulfilled their duty to worship God. But true worship is not an event. It is a lifestyle. It is not confined to a building, a day of the week, or a specific set of activities. Worship is meant to be the very essence of a believer's life, an ongoing, daily expression of love, surrender, and devotion to God. When worship is limited to Sunday mornings, it becomes a religious routine rather than a genuine connection with God. Many people rely on the worship team to lead them into God's presence, but the moment the music stops, their worship stops. They depend on the preacher to inspire them, but when the sermon ends, their passion fades. This reveals a misunderstanding of what worship truly is. Worship is not something that happens to us, or something we passively receive. It is something we actively engage in, not just on Sunday, but every moment of every day. One of the greatest tragedies of limiting worship to a church service is that it creates a divide between the sacred and the secular. Many believers live with the mindset that what happens in church is holy, but what happens outside of church is separate. They sing passionately on Sunday but struggle to maintain that connection with God throughout the week. Their faith is strong in the church pew but weak in their daily lives. This compartmentalization of worship is dangerous because it leads to a life that is disconnected from God's presence. Worship was never meant to be confined to a single gathering. It was meant to be the constant posture of a believer's heart. True worshipers understand that worship is not just about singing songs. It is about how they live. They do not wait for Sunday morning to enter God's presence, because they are already walking in His presence daily. Their worship is not dependent on the atmosphere of a service, but on their personal relationship with God. They worship in their homes, in their workplaces, in their conversations, and in their daily decisions. Every action they take is an act of worship, because they live with the awareness that God is present in every moment. Worship is about surrender. Many people believe worship is about how they feel, but true worship is about laying everything before God in obedience. It is easy to worship when the music is moving, when emotions are high, and when the environment feels right. But what happens when the music stops? What happens when life gets difficult? What happens when challenges arise? Worship is not tested in the moments when everything is going well. It is tested in the moments when worship requires a sacrifice. True worshipers understand that worship is not just about expressing love for God when it is easy, but about remaining faithful to Him in every season. When worship is confined to Sunday, it creates a faith that is shallow and inconsistent. Many believers experience powerful moments in church but struggle to maintain that connection throughout the week. They feel God's presence during the service but feel distant from Him on Monday. This is because they have made worship an event rather than a lifestyle. Worship is not something that should be turned on and off based on circumstances. It should be continuous, flowing from a heart that is devoted to God at all times. One of the reasons worship has been reduced to an event is because many people have misunderstood its purpose. Worship is not about us, it is about God. It is not about how it makes us feel, it is about giving God the honor He deserves. Many people approach worship as something that is meant to inspire them, encourage them, or make them feel closer to God. But true worship is not about seeking an experience. It is about surrendering to God completely. When worship is only about seeking an emotional experience, it becomes self-centered rather than God-centered. True worshipers do not worship because they feel like it. They worship because God is worthy. The Bible is clear that worship is meant to be a lifestyle. Romans 12:01 says, "Offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. This means that worship is not just about singing, it is about how we live. It is about offering every part of our lives to God in obedience. It is about worshiping Him with our actions, our decisions, our words, and our thoughts. Worship is not something we do only when we are in church. It is something we do in every moment of our lives. When believers limit worship to Sunday morning, they miss out on the fullness of a relationship with God. God does not want just an hour of worship. He wants a life of worship. He desires for His people to walk with Him daily, to seek Him continually, and to live in a way that brings Him glory at all times. Worship is not about attending a service. It is about abiding in His presence. It is about living with a heart that is constantly aware of God, constantly seeking Him, and constantly honoring Him in everything. True worship is reflected in how a person lives outside of church. It is easy to lift hands in worship when surrounded by other believers. But what about in private? True worship is tested in the moments when no one else is watching. It is tested in how a person speaks, how they treat others, and how they respond to challenges. A true worshiper does not change based on their environment because their worship is not confined to a location. It is the foundation of their entire life. Jesus made it clear that worship is about relationship, not routine. He rebuked the Pharisees because they had perfected the art of outward worship but had no true connection with God. They followed traditions, observed rituals, and maintained religious appearances, but their hearts were far from God. This same danger exists today. Many people attend church, sing the right songs, and engage in religious activities but lack true intimacy with God. They have limited their worship to a service rather than allowing it to transform their lives. God is not looking for people who will worship Him only on Sundays. He is looking for people who will worship Him with their entire lives. He is seeking those who will honor Him in every moment, who will walk in obedience even when no one else is watching, and who will live in constant awareness of His presence. True worshipers understand that worship does not end when the service ends. They do not wait for the next Sunday to connect with God because they are already walking with Him daily. Their worship is not dependent on a specific time or place. It is a reflection of their devotion to God at all times. When worship becomes a lifestyle, everything changes. Prayer becomes more than just a routine. It becomes a constant conversation with God. Reading the Word becomes more than just a habit. It becomes nourishment for the soul. Seeking God is no longer something that happens only in a church service. It becomes the priority of life. Worship is not meant to be something believers do. It is meant to be who they are. The call to worship is a call to live differently. It is a call to move beyond Sunday morning and step into a life of continuous worship. God is not interested in performances. He is interested in hearts that are fully devoted to Him. Worship is not measured by how passionately a person sings, but by how completely they surrender. Worship is not about one day of the week. It is about every moment of every day. True worshipers understand that worship is not an event. It is a life fully surrendered to God. Many people approach worship with an expectation of receiving something, rather than giving. They come to Sunday services hoping to be moved, inspired, or uplifted. They seek an emotional experience, a breakthrough, or a personal encounter. While there is nothing wrong with desiring to experience God's presence, true worship is not about what we can receive. It is about what we give to Him. Worship is not a transaction, it is an offering. It is not about coming to get something, it is about coming to give everything. The heart of worship is surrender. From the very beginning, God designed worship as an act of giving, not receiving. When Abraham took Isaac to the mountain to offer him as a sacrifice, he told his servants, "We will go and worship." This statement reveals something powerful. Worship is about surrendering what is most precious to us. It is about laying everything down before God, not because we want something in return, but because He is worthy. Abraham was not worshiping to receive a blessing. He was worshiping by giving his greatest treasure to God. Many people today have redefined worship to mean an experience that benefits them. They want the songs to move them, the atmosphere to stir them, and the message to inspire them. They evaluate worship based on how it makes them feel rather than whether it pleases God. It is not about being entertained. It is about reverence. Worship is not meant to cater to our emotions. It is meant to glorify God. When we shift our focus from receiving to giving, we begin to understand what worship truly is. The idea that worship is about receiving rather than giving has led to a consumer mindset in the church. People choose churches based on the style of worship that suits them, the type of preaching that appeals to them, and the environment that makes them feel most comfortable. They evaluate a worship service based on how much they got out of it. But worship is not about personal preference. It is about God's presence. It is not about what pleases us. It is about what pleases Him. The moment worship becomes about us, it ceases to be true worship. In the Old Testament, worship always involved an offering. When the Israelites approached God, they never came empty-handed. They brought sacrifices, offerings of thanksgiving, atonement, and devotion. Their worship was not about what they could receive, but about what they could give. David understood this when he said, "I will not offer to the Lord that which costs me nothing." True worship requires sacrifice. It requires laying down our pride, our plans, our desires, and even our comforts. It is about saying, "Lord, I give you my heart, my life, my everything, not because I want something in return, but because you are worthy." One of the greatest misconceptions about worship is that it is something we do for our benefit. People say, "I didn't feel anything during worship," or "I didn't get anything out of that service." But worship is not about what we feel. It is about what we offer. In the book of Acts, Paul and Silas worshipped in prison, not because they felt good, but because they knew God was worthy. Their worship was not dependent on their circumstances. It was a response to who God is. They were in chains, beaten and suffering, yet they worshipped. This reveals that true worship is not about what we receive. It is about the heart we bring before God, no matter the situation. When people approach worship with the expectation of receiving, they often become frustrated when they do not feel anything. They wait for a certain moment, a particular song, or an emotional experience to validate their worship. But worship is not about us. It is about God. True worshipers do not wait to be moved. They worship because they know God deserves it. They do not rely on emotions to stir them. They choose to worship out of love and reverence. In the Gospel of John, we see a powerful contrast between two people who approached Jesus. One with a heart of worship and the other with a heart of self-interest. Mary came to Jesus with a costly alabaster jar of perfume. She broke it and poured it on his feet as an act of extravagant worship. She did not come to receive anything. She came to give him her best. In contrast, Judas criticized her, asking why the perfume was wasted instead of being sold for money. Judas was focused on personal gain, while Mary was focused on worship. This is the difference between a worshiper and a consumer. A true worshiper is willing to give their best to God, while a consumer is only concerned with what they can gain. True worship demands that we shift our perspective. Instead of coming to church with the question, "What will I get from this?" we must ask, "What can I give to God today?" Instead of evaluating a worship service based on how it made us feel, we must ask, "Did I give God my best?" Worship is not about waiting to receive. It is about intentionally offering God the honor He deserves. Jesus demonstrated the ultimate act of worship when He surrendered His life on the cross. He did not come to be served, but to serve. He did not come seeking His own will, but to do the will of the Father. His life was a constant offering of worship. He gave everything, not for personal gain, but out of love and obedience to the Father. If we are to be true worshipers, our lives must reflect the same heart of surrender. Worship is not just about singing songs. It is about living in a way that honors God in everything we do. When we make worship about receiving, we turn it into a self-centered activity. But when we understand that worship is about giving, it transforms everything. We no longer approach God with a list of demands. We come with a heart of gratitude. We no longer wait for the right emotions. We worship because He is worthy. We no longer seek an experience. We seek to glorify Him. This is what true worship looks like. A life fully surrendered, fully devoted, and fully given to God. The danger of making worship about receiving is that it leads to inconsistency. When people worship only when they feel like it, their worship becomes unstable. They worship passionately when life is good, but struggle when life is hard. But a true worshiper worships in every season. whether in abundance or in need, whether in joy or in sorrow, whether in victory or in suffering, they continue to give God their worship because they understand that worship is not about their circumstances. It is about His worthiness. God is not looking for worshipers who come to receive. He is looking for those who come to give. He is seeking those who will worship Him with all their heart, soul, mind, and strength. Not because of what they can get, but because of who He is. Worship is not about us, it is about Him. It is not about our feelings, it is about our faithfulness. It is not about our preferences, it is about His presence. True worshipers do not wait for a reason to worship. They worship because God is always worthy. When we shift our mindset from receiving to giving, our entire approach to worship changes. We stop waiting for the perfect moment and start worshiping in every moment. We stop seeking personal benefits and start seeking God's glory. We stop making worship about what we can get and start making it about what we can give. This is the essence of true worship. A heart that comes before God not with demands but with devotion. A heart that does not wait to be filled but chooses to be poured out. A heart that does not seek its own desires but seeks to glorify God in all things. This is the kind of worship that pleases God. This is the kind of worship He is seeking. And this is the kind of worship that will transform our lives forever. Worship is not just something we do, it is who we are. Many people think of worship as an activity, something that happens when music is played, when prayers are lifted, or when a church service is conducted. But worship is not confined to a set time, place, or method. Worship is an identity. It is the very essence of who we were created to be. God designed humanity for worship. And until we understand this, we will always limit worship to a temporary experience rather than a permanent reality. From the beginning of creation, worship was embedded in the purpose of mankind. When God created Adam and Eve, their very existence was an act of worship. They lived in perfect harmony with God, walking with Him, communing with Him, and honoring Him in all they did. Worship was not something they had to do. It was simply who they were. They did not need a designated time or place to worship because their entire existence was an expression of worship. This is the original design for humanity, to live in continuous connection with God, glorifying Him in every moment. However, sin disrupted this design. When Adam and Eve disobeyed God, their connection with Him was broken, and with it, their ability to worship freely was compromised. From that moment on, humanity began to search for something to fill the void that only worshiping God could satisfy. People began to worship other things, idols, wealth, power, success, and even themselves. Instead of worship being an identity, it became an activity. Instead of being a lifestyle, it became a ritual. But God's original intention never changed. He still seeks those who will worship Him in spirit and truth, those who will return to the identity they were created for. One of the greatest misunderstandings about worship is that it is primarily an external action. Many people think of worship as the lifting of hands, the singing of songs, or the bowing of heads. While these expressions can be a part of worship, they are not the foundation of worship. True worship is not about what we do externally. It is about who we are internally. It is about the posture of our hearts before God. A person can sing every song perfectly, lift their hands in every service, and say all the right words. But if their heart is not surrendered to God, it is not true worship. Worship is not performance, it is identity. Jesus made this clear when He spoke to the Samaritan woman at the well. She asked Him about the correct place of worship, whether it was on the mountain or in Jerusalem. But Jesus responded with a powerful truth. A time is coming and has now come when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. In other words, worship is not about location, rituals, or outward expressions. It is about the condition of the heart. True worshipers do not worship based on external factors. They worship from a place of internal transformation. When worship is merely an activity, it becomes something people turn on and off. They worship on Sunday but forget about God during the week. They lift their hands in church but fail to honor God in their daily lives. This is not true worship. True worship cannot be compartmentalized. It is not something we do only in certain moments. It is the foundation of who we are. A true worshiper does not stop worshiping when the music ends, because their life is an offering to God. Worship is not just an event they attend, it is the way they live every single day. This is why worship is more than music. Many people associate worship with the songs sung during a church service, but worship is so much deeper than that. Worship is expressed in the way we love others, the way we speak, the way we work, and the way we obey God. When worship is an identity, it affects every part of life. A true worshiper worships in how they treat their family, in how they conduct business, in how they respond to challenges, and in how they live in obedience to God's word. Every moment of life becomes an opportunity to glorify God. Worship as an identity also means that we do not need to wait for perfect conditions to worship. Many people believe they can only worship when they feel spiritually strong, when their emotions are in the right place, or when the circumstances of life are favorable. But a true worshiper understands that worship is not based on emotions or situations. It is based on the unchanging nature of God. Worship does not depend on whether life is going well. Worship remains constant because God remains worthy. The Bible is filled with examples of people who worshiped despite their circumstances. Job worshiped after losing everything. Paul and Silas worshiped while in prison. David worshiped in the wilderness. Their worship was not tied to what they were going through, it was tied to who they were. They were not just people who worshiped, they were worshipers. When worship becomes an identity, nothing can stop it. Not trials, not disappointments, not even suffering. A true worshiper does not need ideal conditions to worship because worship is their very nature. This is the kind of worshiper God is looking for. He is not seeking those who will worship Him only when it is convenient, or only when they feel like it. He is seeking those whose hearts are fully devoted to Him, those who worship not because of what they can receive, but because of who He is. He is looking for people who will worship in every season, in every moment, in every aspect of their lives. When worship is an identity, it also brings transformation. Worship is not just about glorifying God, it also changes us. The more we worship, the more we become like Him. The more we fix our hearts on Him, the more we reflect His nature. Worship shifts our focus from ourselves to God. It moves us from being self-centered to being God-centered. It reminds us that life is not about us, it is about Him. When we live as worshipers, we walk in the fullness of what we were created for. Worship as an identity also affects our priorities. When worship is just an activity, it can be scheduled into life like any other task. But when worship is an identity, it becomes the driving force behind everything we do. We no longer fit God into our lives revolve around Him. We no longer seek His presence only on Sundays, we seek Him daily. Worship is no longer something we do out of obligation, it becomes our greatest joy. This is why true worship is powerful. When we embrace worship as our identity, we live in constant connection with God. We do not need to wait for a church service to experience His presence, because we are always walking with Him. Our relationship with God is no longer based on moments of worship. It is built on a life of worship. This is the kind of worship that pleases God, not a worship that is momentary, but one that is continuous. Not a worship that is tied to emotions, but one that is rooted in devotion. Not a worship that is focused on what we can receive, but one that is completely surrendered to Him. When we understand that worship is not just something we do, but who we are, it changes everything. We stop limiting worship to church services and start living lives that glorify God in all things. We stop seeing worship as a temporary experience and start seeing it as the foundation of our existence. We become the worshipers God created us to be. People whose lives are fully surrendered, fully devoted, and fully given to Him. This is true worship. This is what God desires. And this is the life that brings Him the greatest glory.